catalog and just say Cadet, Clarke, and Nacorda all address a diverse migratory perspective within the African diaspora on geography, landscape, portraiture, family, representation, identity, place, memory, and home in their work. In aggregating these artists' work together, my hope was to evoke a discursive conversation amongst peers and a collective understanding of place. And so I hope that we get to that within our discussion today. So to begin, this exhibition brings together 3 talented women of the African diaspora, whose work I feel exemplifies the statement that Blackness is not a monolith. Each photographer's work intersects on the topics of identity, place, migration, and immigration. Specifically, between all of y'all's work, there's a delicate external and internal balance of truth and fiction, or reality and the dream world, and the desire to build an archive of images to serve as evidence of existence of oneself and community. But also the tension of race and culture as it relates to identity and displacement. Arguably, displacement in the sense of mentally and physically, and how the balance of that shifts over time as one grows older. Okay. All of your bodies of work use not only the portrait, but landscape as well. A democratic way to use images in expressing yourself. With that being said, Jasmine, Widline, and Nadiya, I want to pose the following question. What specific social commentaries are you interested in as artists through the use of different visual languages that you employ? And to contextualize that further, thinking about when do you decide on a landscape versus a portrait, thinking about who are you speaking to and who can it reach, thinking about different viewers and entry points to our work as artists. And that's my first question to you all. Feel free to jump in, Widline, Nadiya, or Jasmine.
Okay, I can start then. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely highly personal, and I can only really speak from my point of view or my experiences. But that being said, I do think that there's universal in the specific. So in that way, you know, you would hope that lots of people could relate to each of our stories. I mean, I'm interested in obviously ideas of family, memory, things forgotten. I think also specifically the feeling of going home and it maybe not being how you remembered and the strangeness in that. And to sort of talk about the visual language, I think that's part of why I might obscure a lot of faces in my portraits. I think I'm trying or aiming to create a sense of timelessness or uncertainty by leaving out key distinguishers, like the face being either covered in shadow or maybe turned away. You're sort of left wondering or looking for answers, and maybe the viewer can describe their own meaning to the photographs that way. But I think other times, you know, I do want things to be very clear and straightforward and for the subject to confront the camera. And I think by playing with that juxtaposition between obscurity and clarity, I think I'm trying to deal with concepts of the gaze and representation and who you allow to view you and when. Yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, I think to go off of Jasmine's point, the idea of erasing time, I think one of the things that I think about in my work is how do I make visible like these internal signifiers that I have based on my own experiences. So when I decide to do a landscape, at times it's based on seeing something that I recognize from childhood or something that I recognize from when I lived in Haiti or something that I recognize from a specific experience with a specific person. And so I think sometimes those internal signifiers, those internal references that I photograph can become something that only I have access to, something only in the way that I make it, but it's also at times something that other people can read based on their experience as well. And so I think in terms of making a specific social commentary, I don't know. I think it's hard. I think it varies depending on the day, depending on where I am in my life, honestly. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, like one of the big things, like, you know, they're bringing up these specific signifiers. There's a lot in my work that I try not to discuss explicitly, that I sort of keep within this like sacred space of just like non-explanation. And I think that in and of itself starts to activate a certain type of dynamic between the viewer and the work itself. This question of like, you know, you're going to obviously experience it so differently based on who's seeing it, but the, you know, potential uncomfortability that somebody might feel when coming up to one of my photographs and they don't know, it's not written out or over-explained to them, that to me is pretty important. And so those are the types of things that I kind of look for when deciding, you know, what type of image I'm going to make. When I'm with Lean on the sort of like the social commentary, I think it's also just a really particular time in history and also in like my personal history where I'm just like, there's a lot of I don't knows for me right now in my work. So I feel like that's something that is still so much up in the air, and I'm not necessarily sure I will ever get there, if that makes sense. Like maybe within the images that I'm making, maybe the social commentary aspect becomes secondary, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to sum up all of you all's answers into sort of a brief follow-up, but Jasmine, you mentioned universal. Widline, you mentioned this internal dialogue that you're having. And Nadiya, you're talking about there are these specific things that you're speaking to, but sort of that leaving room for interpretation based on viewers' own experiences. Maybe there's some type of intersection between their experience and your experience where you can then begin to have an expanded dialogue through the visual language, through the images that you produce. So,
yeah, I think, and one thing that I've been thinking about a lot this past year is within my work is like one of the questions I think that you sort of like posed is, you know, like who are you speaking to? Who can it reach? And sometimes I'm sort of thinking about also like the polar opposite of that. I was like, who am I? Not necessarily trying to alienate, but who am I like leaving out? And how is that happening? And why? And what does that end up producing? And I think a lot of times that comes down to, the location within which the viewer's coming to the work. But like, what does it mean to not identify and to leave that space open? And to sort of, you know, to not, because I think for me, it's like one of the things I'm thinking, I was like, what does it mean to not handhold the viewer through all of my work, all these images that I'm making, and all the connections that I'm seeing? What if I'm not outlining that like to a T, if that makes sense, you know?
I also want to say that I think sometimes I make images that are just for me.
Yeah.
I think that's another way of phrasing it, is that some images, I think I make it for me to process certain things. I make it specifically for me and only for me. And I think, ultimately I make work for me, but I think certain images, sometimes I think I'm okay with people not understanding it. And and I think that's,
I agree with me.
Yeah. And Widline, as you mentioned that, I was looking at some of your titles today, and that's definitely evident. Some of your titles are like directly speaking. It's almost like you're directly speaking to yourself, but then leaving it also open for viewers to sort of interpret those titles as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's also a means of having people entering my work. I think the language in which I write my titles also, I write it in both Creole and in English. And so I think that's also a particular group of people that I'm talking to and with my work. And I think sometimes even in the titles, some of them are quotes, some of them are references, some of them are from conversations that I have with like my friends, my family members. And so I think some of them are even like from particular readings and things like that. And so I think sometimes they're even in the titles, I can be speaking to a specific person and only me and that person can be having this conversation within the title. Or it can also be where I'm speaking to a whole wider audience and they know it based on the language, based on the word, based on like what quote or whatever the title is itself.
And I do that too within like certain images, and I like to sort of like also like chop it up a little bit. Like one of my I think one of the like the self-portrait that's in the show includes like the Tagalog word for grandmother and grandfather, which is like Lolo and Lola, and it also includes like an Afrikaans word, which is Dukwa, which is like it's an Afrikaans word for just like a head wrap. And I grew up with like if you like growing up Black, you have to wrap your hair before you go to bed. So my family would just call it a dukwa, and it's not like Afrikaans is sort of like a variation of Dutch, but which also like has this tone and connection to the colonization of South Africa. But that's just the word that colloquially like my family uses, and so yeah, sometimes I like to play with titles in a way, like how can I mash things up in ways that if you didn't necessarily know the references, you'd end up somewhat confused. But I think that's the point that I'm trying to make, because you come upon these new words and you're like, I have no idea what that means. And what does it mean to have like this like Afrikaans word just like sandwiched in between the sentence? Yeah. Which again, in my experience, my household is very normal. And fluid, but obviously for somebody outside, they'd be like, I don't even, like, why is this, like, what even is that word? What is it doing there?
Mm-hmm. Thank you all so much. And Jasmine, did you want to tag on there at the end, or I can move to the next question?
Oh, yeah, we can go there.
Okay. All right. So next, I want to move on to the topic of genres within photography specifically. To frame this next question, I like to use a text I often reflect on personally. It's titled Family Folklores, Kierman Weems, Alan Sekula, and the Critique of Documentary Photography by Irina Dugane, a professor of art at Texas State University. And in summary, this article looks at a critique on documentary photography through the lens of its uses in the arena of social reform versus fine art. And so Sekula calls for a reinvention of documentary photography from its formal use as a social critique. And there's a quote from him that says, referring to documentary photography, it was done so mostly in an uncritical and even voyeuristic sense, rather than question the assumed objectivity and neutrality of this practice, as well as the power relationships enacted in its depiction of victimhood. These characteristics were seen as implicit and unproblematic to the media. So this article goes on to address what Sekula's reinvention of documentary photography meant, specifically for artist Kierman Weems in relationship to her first body of work titled Family Pictures and Stories. And so, in summary, in the article, Weems quickly came to realize that a photograph can be slanted. How do you ensure that it is understood within your intended context. With this body of work, Weems is visually working against this 1965 report called The Negro Family, a case study for national action, which perpetuates stereotypes about Black men and women within the family dynamic or structure. Weems, at this time as a young artist, had a keen sense of understanding her role as both subject and artist, the significance of that. Also, an awareness of African American representation in mainstream media and in the fine art world at the time, especially within the tradition of documentary photography, which was often depicting African Americans as hopeless and powerless victims, socially and economically depressed. With all this being considered, I'm going to circle back to all of you all's practices individually. In a conversation with Patrice Helmer that was on the Reservoir Quarterly, Widline, you talk about traveling back to Haiti to photograph family and the community you mentioned, and an apprehension from the people I wanted to photograph outside of my family. And then you also said, I stopped and asked myself if this was really what I wanted or was needed. Was I adding anything new to the conversation? And again, circling back to Jasmine, your project, Shadow of the Palm. In an interview on Strange Fire Collective, you said, you're dealing with the dissonance felt between dream and reality, how it relates to your work, and maybe more broadly, your relationship with photography or what photography does. And then on to Nadiya. In a few interviews that I read about you, you mentioned the following things: seeking to create an archive of images to serve as evidence of our existence, significance, and humanity in a world that seeks to erase us. The maddening world I exist within, and my attempt to find an inner space of safety and quiet reprieve. Also referring to that maddening world, it is one full of oppression, dehumanization, and agony. And then your photographs represent the quiet one that you need to survive. So my question for the three of you is, where do you locate yourself in terms of genre as it relates to the history of photography and contemporarily, if any? And to contextualize that question further, within this context of the African diaspora, all of you are working on such a personal level. And then you're in the situation where also others can lump you into documentary genre. But all of you have these moments of epiphany that I just read and what it is you really want from the medium of photography. You step back and ask yourself the big questions within your own practice. So, Widline, Nadiya, or Jasmine, feel free to answer that question.
I think I don't mind being categorized as a documentary photographer. I think I use elements of documentary photography in parts of my work in different aspects. But I don't think that's all that I want to be labeled as. And I think that would be limiting my practice to one thing and one thing only. I don't think that's what I do, and that's not what I'm interested in. I think, and the idea of naming it as documentary photography, I would be like limiting myself to this thing, which I don't think I ascribe to. I think when I make images, when I make work, I don't want to start off by limiting what it is that I want to do. And so I think the one way that I play around with that is that my images aren't necessarily, most of my images are pretty posed. So if you think about the normal definition of documentary, I think you would probably have a problem with that. So yeah, I use elements of documentary, but I don't think that's the only thing that it should be labeled as in my case.
Yeah, I think I don't necessarily prescribe to one genre or feel connected to it in that way. I'm definitely interested in the space between genres, if that makes sense. We're not necessarily attached intensely to documentary or full manipulation, full scale fiction, but if there's some sort of speculative space in between those worlds, I think I find that a really interesting place to work from and make art from. And in a similar way, I guess, a lot of my photos are more constructed or thought of beforehand. So in that way, they wouldn't necessarily always, I think, be labeled documentary or be allowed to be documentary. I mean, I've always even had the hard time trying to understand, like, journalism and documentary learning, like, oh, I can't tell someone to sit like that or change it. I was like, why can't I change it? I just want to, put my hand into it. But yeah, so I think that's sort of an interesting place to exist and to make work from. And in that way, it's sort of, I mean, in the history of photography, I really like pictorialism, which was a late 1800s, early 1900s genre. And it's sort of, people made photographs from a very emotional interior place in their lives. And I like seeing that that's persisted, 100 years later, basically, that we still do that and still make work from that space. So I think that's kind of cool. Maybe there's a revival of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I resonate a lot with what, Jasmine was saying about being in between genres. I think starting out, as a photographer when I was a lot younger, I got really hung up on genres and having a hard time sort of wanting to fit in within one space or another. With Lean, a lot of my images are quite posed and staged. So again, the sort of quote unquote traditional that definition of that. And so I think I have worked really hard to make the work first and to consider and, digest what genre might mean second. And to see that, to see genres as fairly overlapping in a lot of ways, to me is helpful. Wherein there are times where it's been fairly limiting.
I also think that the fact that the way that we exist in the world as Black women is at so many intersections. I don't think it would make sense for us to just be so one-dimensional and be documentary photographers in that way. And I don't think that's how I can express my experience either. And so I think, I don't think it would even make sense for me personally to be, I guess, strictly limited by this one idea of genre. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about the act of, or the intention of existing between genres, sort of that Jasmine was referencing, and sort of breaking out of those confines, what is sort of implied by that action as well, and something that, again, sort of as Black women, you have to do and are constantly doing, so I think that in and of itself is sort of, I don't know, I think it retains its own significance, I think, for me, in terms of that action as a Black woman artist.
Yeah, and I think in using Kira Mae Weems's work to sort of structure this, even in that early body of work, the family folklores, realizing the different stipulations that the genre of documentary can bring, and then even inserting herself in front of the camera in that work. And then I'm thinking about all of you all's and your self-portraits that you do within your work. And I'm so happy to hear you all's answers about how fluid your practices are, not being limited to documentary photography, but in a way working against that traditional format in the fact and thinking about the posing of images, but them also still being able to, the potential of them also still being read as reality. So I just think that's interesting. I really enjoyed all of y'all's response to that, and I hope we can continue this conversation. And I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to turn it over to Widline and allow all three of you to extend the conversation amongst yourselves with questions for one another.
Well, can I say one more thing before I forget
Absolutely.
it?
Go ahead.
Like, also, I think the way that you put images together, and in terms of like, you know, thinking about like what is in the photograph, but also like what photograph is next to what image, you know, in talking about sort of disrupting that like sense of like linear genre, for example. Really take it away, Widline.
I guess going off of Aaron's question, another thing I was curious about is, I think something we all have in common is that we photograph our families, and so as part of our practice. So based on that, I wonder if, I guess, Nadiya and Jasmine, if you could speak a little bit more about if you have found yourself having to negotiate how your photographs exist. For example, like, is a family photo actually a fine art? Like the idea of having like family pictures existing as fine art images, things like that. So have you had to negotiate that in making work or outside of making work or to other people?
Yeah, I mean, I do just want to then touch on I don't know, just to go back to the last thing very quickly, I'm always wary of then prescribing like truth to documentary photos even in general. I think, you know, everything is subjective. Photography is one of the few mediums that we insist on ascribing truth to and seeing as real. And I think that's so interesting. And it's part of why I really love the medium, because it is so mysterious. The clarity is deceptive, I think. Yeah, so it's just really interesting, like the language around documentary photography. And I don't prescribe any more truth or I don't know what the opposite of truth is, lie, not truth, to my photos than, you know, a documentary photo of, you know, a girl my sister's age at the beach that's unposed on stage. I don't think either is less true or more true. But to go back to Widline's question, yeah, I think if a family photo is a fine art photo or where that exists, I think there can be a crossover between the two, or you know, I would try not to concern myself with the distinction, but I guess it does also come down to context and intent. I think with all arts, it can come down to that. I do think it's sort of interesting personally. My family does see a distinction when I photograph them, which is so interesting. If I'm there to, you know, photograph Christmas morning, you know, a graduation, and I'm there with my camera, everyone's smiling, and it's a totally different vibe than when it's like, oh, Jasmine's going to make some art right now. So, like, you know, no one's going to smile, and we're going to do some, like, weird stuff right now. They really see it as, like, two very different practices. And I wonder maybe if I can try to, like, meld those or not make it that way, or it's just the way it is. But I do think it's so interesting, like, even if, you know, dealing with these issues, like, is it art or is it not? It's just so interesting, like, that often the people that I am photographing definitely think it's different. So I guess the experience is what makes it different. And yeah, so again, it's for, I guess, like, documenting versus maybe trying to capture an atmosphere or a pervading tone or mood, which I guess is hard to do.
Yeah, I came to photography photographing my family. And specifically my two youngest siblings when I was still in high school. And yeah, so I find it somewhat, this thing that feels like very automatic, like it feels very, because I was doing it for so long before I was even thinking about before I even knew like how to even talk about what a fine art photograph was. Like I was literally just documenting the childhood, the childhoods of my two youngest siblings, so that they could have photographs to reference and to look back on. And so, and that being said, now that I'm in the position I am now, I find it sometimes really difficult because sometimes I miss that space of what you're talking about. Is like, okay, is it considered a fine art photograph? How do we negotiate that? Where does the photo end up? And that sort of exposure and vulnerability that inevitably ends up happening. I think particularly when we're talking about, for me, like photographing my siblings, like Black youth, I think it's sort of difficult. And so sometimes I miss that space of sort of your Jasmine talking about, like I'm just photographing Christmas morning, that space of making work. Sometimes I miss that. I miss being able to get back to that because sometimes I question as to whether or not I can get back there at all. If the photograph ends up in a certain place, if that makes sense. Like if the photograph ends up in a space that's going to be exhibited or distributed, is it still, and how is it disconnected from that space of, I don't know how to call it, but, or like get privacy, really, I think. And what is it, I'm still sort of questioning, well, yeah, what does it mean to take all of these private images and make them public? And in what spaces am I allowing that to happen? And how? And I think to more so answer Whitney's question, the thing that I've had to do is I've just had to be really, really stingy with my work. I'm very particular about where it gets seen, what does not get posted. And that has particular consequences, of course, within our world now, where it feels like a very it feels like a very pressurized system in order to make an image as an artist and immediately get it out and have it exhibited in all these places or whatever. I think especially now that we can't physically see images, so there's sort of a loss of context. For me in particular, I think that's really important to me. And so having lost that this year, I sort of just, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to take it all. I'm just going to hide it for a while. And then we'll see sort of what happens down the road of what gets released, what doesn't. And that's sort of been how I've, dealt with it.
How would you answer your question?
I think I do think about it. I think one of the most important part of my practice is that I do make photographs as a means of archiving my family's memories, my family in general. And so I think talking back about what you were saying about the idea of photographing people at graduation, photographing at family reunion, and photographing my family Christmas morning, which I've started doing every year. And so I think I would like for there to not be such a distinction. And I think the intention when I'm taking a photograph, my family act or pose with the intention that they will be seen at some point by someone, somewhere. It may not be now, it may be 30 years from now, I think. But I think they come into a frame with that as something behind their mind. So I think that, I don't know if that answers my question, actually.
It is really how to negotiate that space. Yeah, and I do think it's important, or I find it important that right, like I don't want there to be a distinction, but at the same time, like I also want us to like enter into this agreement together, whether this is completely private or maybe not completely private. And I don't know. I think that's I don't know.
I guess the question I've been asking myself is, why is it a distinction? Is the other like work that you make not as personal in the same way?
Right. Yeah, I don't know.
I also think about the fact, like my family in particular, like nobody wants me to photograph them. Like I have to, my two youngest siblings, which again, there's like a very particular power dynamic there. We have a really like open relationship, but I talk to them about where they're like, yeah, whatever, we don't care. But like everybody, like my mom, my dad, like they all like absolutely just like don't want to be documented or photographed. And that, it's so funny. And it's really difficult in a lot of ways. And I think it's sort of interesting with you saying that like your family walks into or like shows up in terms of a family dynamic expecting it. And I can't even like convince, like that picture of my grandmother in my backyard. I had to work so hard to get her to let me photograph her. Yeah, and so I think about, like, I mean, isn't it like completely and totally her right to just be like, like screw off, Nadiya, I don't want to be photographed. But I'm like, for me, I'm like, you're so important to me. You're my nana. I want to photograph you. Like you are like this like incredible matriarch or a family. It's like the whole of like what I'm trying to discuss in my work. I have to photograph you like in this way and like whatever. And so, yeah, it's that dynamic even in and of itself becomes sort of, I think, a part of it, because it's this, I talk about like secrecy, like the things that don't get said within a family dynamic, specifically within, women within a family, the things we hide, the things we don't discuss. And so it's like her like not even wanting to be documented by me or for the image to end up circulating. Those are sort of things I think about when I'm trying to like just hold on to like a piece of her in a way.
Yeah, and I guess going off of that, I think one of the things that I experience when I'm I guess depending on who I'm photographing, I photograph my mom and her siblings, and they're older. My mom is in her 60s, and her siblings are in their 80s, almost reaching 90s, some of them. And so one of the things that I'm actually fascinated by is that when I photograph my mom and her siblings, some of them who live in Haiti, is that when this is like the way that I photograph them, maybe like the first or like second or even maybe the third time in their life that they're actually having themselves be documented in this way that's not like a passport photo or like some kind of like official document way. And so I guess I'm wondering if you've had that experience as well.
Yeah, I have. I mean, I have, and I think in a similar way. I lost what I was going to say. Just talking about public and private, I guess. I think I also always want it to be sort of collaborative if it can be. In that way, I do think I like to think about, maybe how we can work together on this, or what do you want to do? Where do you want to sit? But it is interesting, like, my sister, for example, will be like, oh, are we like doing art now, or are we, like, are we just like snapping? And it's interesting because then it's like, I don't know, let's just see where it goes. Let's do whatever. But I like that she likes to sort of think of it as like, oh, it's like collaboration time. We're going to like figure this out. So it becomes kind of like a fun project for us.
Yeah, I think, especially with photographing my grandmother, I don't think she'd been photographed in that way for like a very, very long time. And yeah, and I guess the sort of interesting part of it is like she may never again also as well. Yeah. And again, like I think in my family in particular, there's an avoidance of being documented. Like I'm the one who wants to document everything. Everybody else, like they don't want things to be seen. So there's this like wanting to hide, or not wanting to hide, but not wanting to, you know, be vulnerable in that way of like being seen. Like, oh, you know, it's, yeah. And I mean, it's like one of those things, like, you know, like Nana does not leave the house without her earrings. She physically will not like pass out the door without having her earrings on. But that's something that I do too. Like I have earrings on right now because I literally looked for them for this presentation because I was like, I can't do the presentation without the earrings on. But yeah, but then there's that like that I'm the one who's going to end up creating like the image you're talking about. Like, yeah, this is the only one they're going to have of it. They may not have it. Yeah, it's like it's going to if it happens through me, it's probably not. This is probably the only instance it's going to happen in. Because nobody else is going to make that photograph. And the people I'm photographing also aren't going to seek it out either. Yeah, which has its own things about that.
Maybe that's the social commentary Erin was asking about.
Widline found it.
I found it.
Yeah, I think. Oh no, go ahead, Widline.
Go ahead. I have nothing to say.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, maybe that is the social commentary that I was sort of referring to, because just asking about and thinking about the positions you all find yourselves in, and then I also do this type of work as well, photographing my family. So I'm always thinking about. All these things that you all have already said, like where the image is going. There was something that I mentioned earlier about how do you make sure that the proper context goes along with the image when you do allow it out into the world. And Widline, I've read about your work in terms of thinking about that as well. And this private and personal space in these specific bodies of work that are in the show. And I think it's important to have these type of conversations with other artists doing similar things. And that's why I'm so excited about the exhibition and the catalog existing, and the potential of looking back on this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Then how does that start to develop, to evolve the conversation from Carrie Mae Weems, whose practice who's evolved and who does all these different things, starting from photographing her family. So I just find it also interesting and to see us in this generation doing the same things and sort of, but in a different way, is like I just get really excited about it and about these type of opportunities. But, yeah. Zimmy, how are we on time? Are we okay?
We're doing all right. So if you had any more questions to talk about amongst yourselves, that's great. And then we can open it up to the audience.
Okay. Nadiya or Jasmine, did you all want to pose a question amongst one another, and then we can move on to question and answers from the audience?
Jasmine, I really liked your question more than my question.
Yeah.
So I was really interested to talk about
my question. I think it was like, how's the last year been with making work, or has it changed the way you make work or look at your work in any way, if it has at all?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's inevitable that it would, right? Like, what hasn't been changed? I think the reason why I'm so I'm interested in talking about this with y'all is like because it abruptly just was like so isolating. everything that happened starting in the spring. And I think it continues to be fairly isolating. And so wondering, like how are you doing it, if you're doing it at all, making work, and how you're doing it.
I think it has changed. Like you said, like it would be kind of weird for it not to have changed. I was very fortunate that I got to spend a lot of time alone and like with my practice when the pandemic first started. And I think comparing to where I am now from last year around this time, I'm in a very different place in my life in general. And so I have had more time to think about my work, more time to, I think that's all I do actually is think about my work.
All I do is.
Not necessarily that I've made like 100 images or anything in that way, but I think, my work has been like my solitude, like my resting place this past year. And so I think I've had more time to think about it. I've had more time to know what it is that I want to do. Or, I don't know, I wouldn't say that actually. To know that I want to do it for as long as I can, I think. Not necessarily that I know where it's going or anything like that. But yeah. I don't know if that answered the question. Actually, not. You, Jasmine?
I mean, I definitely found it very hard. I think I felt kind of dejected in the beginning of the quarantine. I think it was hard for me to make work in the beginning for a lot of it, or to think about it. But sort of as it became more clear, like, is this going to be very, very long term? I could sort of recontextualize and think, how can I like make this like isolation work for me? Or I think if I felt because I usually spend a lot of time with, again, family in the summer. That's mostly when I spend a lot of time with family, so it was hard to feel like so alone, I think.
Hi, babe. Well, it's
I felt that too.
Still, huh? Yeah. Don't you think?
Not having I haven't seen my mom in over a year. I think, and I think I have a specific like pattern to my work where I spend time with my family. I end up like just like making just like a ton of images without necessarily like processing any of them. And then I have like what Lena, you're talking about, like then I have like the solitude where I like spend a lot of time going through them. And so I find that when I'm trying, like, go to like, if I'm like, oh, I'm gonna spend some time with my work, it's like it's all the same stuff I've already processed, and I'm like, I can't process this anymore. Like I need my like flow, because like I'm just living in this like ebb. And I mean, for me, it feels like stuff's on pause for me, and in a personal sense, things aren't really on pause for me. But it felt like that the rhythm of how I make work, was completely interrupted, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure it'll shift until I can actually see and be with those people in person.
I think you didn't. Widline, you had another question too that I also wanted to hear your guys' answers to. About your influences. Oh, you're muted.
I hate this mute button. I think I was curious to hear you both talk about what are some of your influences in terms of your things that have like influence your photographic language, the way you see things, the way that you photograph things and things like that. And it can be like other artists, things from like childhood or movies, anything actually.
Okay. I get a lot of influence from books. for some reason. Maybe a lot of people do, but I think specifically this novel Cain by this writer Jean Toomer. It's a 1923 novel, and it's sort of vignettes about Black people in America, and they're all sort of disconnected in a way, but I think together they weave together this powerful narrative, and there's a lot of imagery in it that I think was what mainly stuck in my head, like ferns, cane, dust, purple evenings, fire. There were these like symbols that became really powerful to me, and I saw it very visually, and I wondered if there was a way to sort of bring that into my photographic work. So that's definitely one of my main influences. And then I think I'm also, even though I don't think I fit into this genre again, but I really am influenced by Afrofuturistic works. I guess maybe like Love is the Message is Death by Arthur Jaffa, which sort of uses science fiction or some tropes of science fiction interspersed to kind of explore feelings of otherness or alienation. And even though I don't think my work is like explicitly Afrofuturistic, I think I'm interested in themes of magical realism, and in that way it sort of might come through, or those are the things I'm thinking about when I'm making work.
Oh, what am I thinking about when I'm making work? When you asked the question, the first thing that came to my mind was like the way that I would go through my own family's albums, like of images that were taken in their home countries. So images like specifically of my dad growing up in the Philippines, or images of my family like back in South Africa, and these places that I didn't have access to as a child. Like I visited the Philippines like once when I was a child, but like generally speaking, it was like this place that that I was from, my family was from, and this obviously this like micro world that I lived in within my family in the United States. But yeah, so I don't know, I think particularly like the work that was just up on my website, I think about like those, like the visual languages of the images of that time period. So you see, I don't know if it's on my website, but in the series, in my mind, there's like images of my dad and my aunt from like the 60s in the Philippines, and I've like scanned them in, and there's a very particular like visual language in terms of the type of photograph, like how it was made, and like the materiality of those images are like something that I'm really sort of motivated by, and how by connecting them into one series, there's like this, like I think about it as this sort of like looking at all the images, you almost like you time travel from like images from like my, maybe it's from my mom's childhood in Detroit to like my dad growing up in the Philippines to my grandmother in South Africa, and when she's becoming a mother in, God, what year was that? Like the late 50s during apartheid. And so like I think about like sort of like Jasmine, you were referencing like Afrofuturism, but like I think about the themes within that, like the collapsing of time, like time as being non-linear. And so like when I take those images and I like piece them all together into one series, again, without outlining it for the viewer within wherever those images are seen, compiling those together, and how looking at how they're thread, and how that those invisible connections that of course I see, but maybe somebody else doesn't see. I think that my answer. And it's also interesting, one of the photographs of my mom like on the porch in Detroit from the 70s, the image looks so like from the 70s, and her outfit is just like, it just like places her in such a particular way. And like, I don't even physically have that image. Like, that image is an iPhone image that I took of that photograph when I found it when I visited family in South Africa, like, a couple of years ago. Yeah, that image. Like, I don't actually even have that image. I really, like, regret not, like, borrowing it when I found it from them. But yeah, so I think this sort of, like, these markers of time, place, culture, like, you know, even the way that she's, like, what she's wearing and how she's holding her feet, and these, like, cultural markers of, like, Black America at that time. Yeah, and so, but again, so I look at that, I think, within a lot of my family photographs as well, like how to bring that visual language to my work. That was a very long question.
I think I'm interested in your idea of, like, time traveling. I think last year this was something that we were both obsessed about, was thinking about the idea of time traveling through images, or just time traveling in general, and Afrofuturism too. And so I'm wondering, Jasmine, do you think that's something that is part of your work as well?
Yeah, I think the maybe collapsing of time, I related to that a lot. I mean, this project was specifically influenced by a dream that my dad told me. We were in Jamaica driving through the mountains of where he's from, and basically he just started recounting this dream he has about missing his school bus and sort of having to go along the same road running to go catch it. And it was just such a strange feeling of driving through this space with him while he told me the story from his childhood. And it sort of got me thinking about, like, these concepts of maybe foreignness and things that should be known, and that sort of disconnect as well. And it was just this, like, really apparent moment of, like, this collapsing of time. And I think in that way I sort of tried to show that visually in a lot of my images as well. So yeah, I definitely relate to that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I love to think about, like, how can I have my images sort of parallel these notions of how people tell stories in my family, like the oral histories, and how, you know, like, you talk to my grandmother and she will, like, start a story in the middle, and you'll just have to, like, catch up. And, like, you know, the way it's even her describing things or saying things, like, I imagine maybe Jasmine, that's, like, in your dad, like, the sense of dream too, like, no beginning, no real end. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so how can my photographs do that? And I mean, obviously that's something I actively work for. I don't necessarily think it's like, okay, it's done, but those are sort of the things I think about too.
Should we take questions, Zimi?
Sure, that sounds great. I did have a question that came in through the chat. I could start it off. And this is from Jennifer Stutz. She writes, I noticed a connection to Syracuse. Several of you have studied or are studying there, and that LaToya Ruby Frazier is a graduate known for her images of family, and under Carrie Mae Weems, if memory serves. Can Widline and Nadiya speak to why they chose Syracuse to study photography in terms of mentors and community?
You want to, Nadiya?
You go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was definitely, like, how I came to be like, aware of the program there. And I thought a lot about LaToya Ruby Frazier's work in the context of like, place, because my family, you know, immigrated from South Africa, ended up in Detroit, and a lot of the things that she discusses in that work parallel a lot of this, like, similar, obviously not exactly the same, but similar things that would like happened in my family. And so I think for me, I sort of saw the work that she was making and thinking about, like the way, if she was able to make work in that way, and like who was there supporting her, and seeing her as a Black woman making that work. Definitely that was sort of one of the things that piqued my interest in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think all of the things that Nadiya mentioned are probably the same for me. But I also think, like, I ended up in Syracuse. I applied to 4 grad schools, and I think I ended up in Syracuse based on a lot of reasons, but primarily financial reasons, and also because what I wanted, what I needed at the time, when I was going to grad school, that I wanted to be in the middle of nowhere, and I wanted to just like not be seen and just make work for 3 years. I just wanted to disappear, basically, is how I'm going to put it. And so that is one of the reasons I ended up in Syracuse as well.
And I meant to mention before we ask for questions, like if you want to raise your hand using the raise hand function, it's right next to your name, I believe, in the participants window. We have a question from Chris Rauschenberg. Oh, Chris, you're muted.
I had a question for Widline, Jasmine, and Nadiya, which is, if Aaron had come to you and said, well, gee, I think I ought to expand this to a 4-woman show, who would you recommend my adding to it? Would any of you had thoughts of who should be with the 3 of you? Because I think it's a really nice combination.
That's hard. I think it's hard to think of on the spot. But I think one of the reasons why Aaron included the 3 of us is because our work has been in conversation before, via Zora and the Strange Fire Collective. And so, I don't know, I think I'm not able to give you an answer, honestly.
I can't think of anything. I don't know. I mean, a lot of people.
Chris, there was and I hope to make this happen in the future, but there were, I wanted 2 more artists to be in the show, but it just timing wise and everything, it just didn't work out that way. But I think this is a perfect exhibition, but I'm hoping to add the 2 other artists in the future. I have been thinking about that.
Who would the other 2 artists be?
Oh, I was one of the artists I'm blanking on right now because I'm just so bad at names, but the one artist that I did want to have a part of the show was Sasha Burgess, whose work under the African Diaspora extends the conversation to Trinidad and Tobago. And she has this series titled There, Yankee, and I interviewed her or highlighted their work before with Lens Scratch. And that was an artist that I really wanted to be a part of this show, and I hope to add in the future. So if anyone, I know Sasha, but if anyone's watching this and knows Sasha, send her a text and tell her we want you in the next round, along with Nadiya, Jasmine, and Widline. But yeah, that's something I constantly think about because some of my graduate seminar students from last semester are in here, and we constantly talked about a discursive enterprise and what that means in terms of, like, as an artist, when you stop and look around and see who else is making work alongside you, and then beyond that, you look and see where the similarities are, and then where the differences are, and then you are influenced by one another. That's why I brought up Kiermay Weems in this conversation. Because
I should have said Widline was one of my influences.
Yeah, because Widline and Nadiya, you all been at the same school. Like, I know you all were in those critiques together. You were in conversation with one another, and though you were, pursuing things, in your individual studio practice, things can't help but, the lines can't help but blur, or you're just aware of one another. And the same thing for Jasmine. And that's what I love so much about art and the community of art, and then opportunities like this. And that's why, exhibition catalogs are so important, because there's a record of this thing existing, this collaboration happening, and then someone else can take it further from there. So let me stop talking.
I got another question in the chat from Max Marshall. Each of your work in the exhibition is beautifully seen and rendered. I'm wondering if you could talk about the desire to make a beautiful image and how we use beauty as a device.
Yeah, I can take that question actually. I think I've been thinking about this more and more, because I think one of the things that keeps happening when people talk about my work, I think one of the first things they mention is beauty of it. And I think that has to do with my idea and how I make work. A lot of the times I make work from memory and the way that I view memory. I think especially in memory of a place, memory of things that happened in childhood, is probably like tainted by like beauty in some way. What's that word people use when you look back at something? And
rose-colored glasses.
Yes. And so I think a lot of the things that I'm thinking about, I sometimes view them through rose-colored glasses. That may or may not have been how it existed when it happened. But I think that is a big part of it. But I also think, why not? I like beautiful things. Why not make beautiful things?
Yeah. I think it's hard sometimes not to. There's this pull to beauty. Like, it's hard to look away from. It's so, like, enticing.
Yes.
Like, desire. Yeah. It's, like, so gluttonous almost to be like, no, I want this, like, beautiful. It's very indulgent. And I think that's, like, a fun, like, space to play in, kind of.
Yeah, I like that word, indulgent. And I think if you don't indulge in your practice and the thing that you're passionate about, what are you going to indulge in? So,
yeah, I had somebody tell me once that, like, my images were, like, too pretty. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, everything said earlier, like, I make work for me. It's like, I make pretty images for me. A lot of the work that hangs in my house is actually my work, because I like the way it looks and I want to look at it. So for me, it's kind of just as simple as that. And I think there can be a lot of critiques about that, but
really,
that's fine. Yeah.
Hey, ouch. Ouch.
Any other questions? I did get a request. Jasmine, would you mind repeating the books that you mentioned that have influenced your work?
Oh, yeah. I think I just mentioned one book. I think yeah. I said Cane, C-A-N-E, by Jean Toomer, Geantoomer. I really like that book. Love that book.
Thank you.
And I think I said, I'm sure most people know it, but then I think I also mentioned Love is the Message is Death by Arthur Jaffa, which is a video piece.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think we can wrap up, but this has been a really nice discussion. Thank you so much for being here with us and taking the time to discuss your work and the show. And yes, please, everyone who is able to and feels comfortable, make an appointment to come see the work before it closes at the end of the month. Otherwise, you can also view it online. And we do have monitors in the front window of the gallery that you can view the shows that way outside as well. So,
thank you, everybody.
Right.
Thank you, Zemi.
Oh yeah, thank you. Okay, well, take care, everyone. Have a nice evening.